What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Sponsored by peer-run support communities Freedom Center, the Icarus Project, and Portland Hearing Voices. Madness Radio can be heard on FM stations on the Pacifica Radio Network and is online at kboo.fm/madnessradio. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today my guest is Rita Marshall. Deborah is a psychiatric survivor and human rights activist who grew up in Australia and today works as an editor in Prague, Czech Republic. So welcome to Madness Radio, Rita Marshall.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show, Deborah. And so you've been really an important figure in the European human rights movement around psychiatry and working with psychiatric survivor issues since 2008. Is that right?
I don't know about being an important figure, but being part of the activist movement has been really important to me personally.
So I'd like to speak more about your work with human rights organizing internationally, but tell us about your own involvement with the psychiatric system. And your family has a history of being psychiatric patients in hospitals. Is that right?
My family are survivors of the Holocaust in Europe who came to Australia, and psychiatry, I think, was the way that distress and crisis and all of these feelings that couldn't be spoken about in relation to the Holocaust and trauma were processed in Australia. So I think my grandfather and different people in my family ended up in the system, on the receiving end of the system, but they didn't necessarily speak about it. It was something that was taboo and shameful. And yeah, I don't think Australia is the most open society in talking about these things either.
So the difficulty in talking about and working through those traumatic experiences with the Holocaust, that may have played a role in people ending up in the psychiatric system instead.
I'm sure. I think the thing that characterized Australia in the 50s and 60s and maybe still today was this need to just, kind of smile and not talk about anything. And I think that suppressing emotion and trauma and difficult things and the cultural history of the family was really important in the short term to surviving and assimilating. People changed their names. They didn't speak languages that they'd grown up speaking. They stopped talking about people who died in awful ways. Often they didn't know what had happened to those people, so there was no way of even creating a story that could be shared in the family. There was just a lot of private grief and guilt. I think when people survive something very difficult, often it means that they had to do things that they didn't necessarily want to do, and so there's guilt that can come with that, even though the actions are often incredibly understandable in retrospect.
So your relatives ended up in psychiatric hospitals and locked up and with different diagnoses.
It wasn't talked about. I don't know exactly what happened in some cases. What I know is that there was a lot of distress and pain, and that people, when the distress became too great, when life became unbearable, people sought help. And the natural progression of help still today in Australia is to end up in psychiatry. If you can't cope, it's seen as an individual problem, and you end up in psychiatry with some kind of medication regime or electroshock in the case of some of us, and then you suffer the results of that in addition to the trauma that you brought there in the first place. So I witnessed a lot of her suffering from when I was small, and it was frightening because she wasn't very verbal, but she was very, very distressed and very frustrated, and there was a lot of anger in her, and which was terrifying to a small child, and she didn't want to live, and that desire to die was so what I lived with from when I was very small, trying to protect her from what she said she wanted to do, and trying in some cases physically to stop her from hurting herself. So that was very hard, but that we never had a conversation about it. I think all these things are forces just that gravitate around you. Maybe they come out in gestures or the way that people, place objects down, or there's something that is non-verbal but is palpable.
How did this affect you as a kid growing up?
I was incredibly nervous. I am an incredibly nervous person, and I was I felt very responsible for what was going on, and I was told I was responsible as well in a lot of cases. And so it wasn't only me inferring this, it was said that I could perhaps be better behaved, or I could be more respectful, I could be more loving, and I became very, very focused on school and on being able to transcend my environment by doing well at school.
And did you start going through your own experiences of distress? I mean, it sounds like this was a great deal of pain and suffering for you.
Yeah, I was very, very nervous, as I say, and as I got older and pressure got greater on me, I would be fine. Sometimes I would be able to perform under pressure, and then other times I couldn't. I was someone who was like an infant, just curled up on the floor and not able to, that's how I appeared, not able to move and not able to communicate. I had huge problems around language, and language and words had always been very, very important to me, like very visceral. When I hear words, I can hear their music and they balance in a way. And when I would become anxious, I would become very alienated from words. I couldn't meet deadlines for work at school, which cost me quite a lot.
Were you able to communicate about your distress with your family? I mean, were they there for you at all and supporting you, or was it just also part of this general taboo of talking about things?
To some degree, my dad understood because he'd had similar problems and at a similar age. And my dad has quite a difficult trauma history that he doesn't really connect with, but he's came to Australia as a child and was living in hiding in Poland. He had a false identity from when he was very small to when he was about 4 years old. He was Jewish, and he had to pretend he was Catholic, which meant he had a different name. He had to recite Catholic prayers. He had to suppress knowledge he had because it was incriminating and dangerous, and it could lead to people being killed. And then he came to Australia and had to be himself again in another context to transmute himself. And so he understood. He'd had trouble with exams, and he'd had trouble performing in the way that people expected him to perform.
And how did you first get involved with mental health treatments and psychiatric interventions?
I was taken to psychiatrists and psychologists very early on, probably from when I was, I guess, about 12 or 13. I'm not sure. A lot of that part of my life is it all kind of muddies together, but it got worse, and I saw many different people, and there were some very alienating experiences. I hated talking, and sometimes they would have my parents there at the same time, which really meant I couldn't talk. And then as I got older and the distress got worse, people started saying that it wasn't enough to be in outpatient and I should go in. And it was originally sort of suggested it would be for a few days, but that turned into many months, and it didn't achieve anything. It was awful.
Was there ever any connection made between the experiences that you were going through and the trauma history of your family and what you were living with on a day-to-day basis, with your mother's being in so much crisis and distress ongoing, and her ongoing suicidal feelings and suicide attempts and all the trauma that was being played out in your family?
In a very, very superficial way by some people, but not really, and in a way that vilified my mum and was just saying, I remember psychiatrists said that their patients are divided into the mad and the bad and the sad. I remember that, and that I was sad, and and so that was kind of an okay status, but my mother was bad. And I did feel angry at my mum. Of course, I felt angry at my mum. And there were times when I really wished that she would just go away. But this kind of lack of understanding of anything, and everything was incredibly superficial. Sometimes there was awful groups, and it was it did nothing. It was just awful.
And so a lot of medications and group meetings and therapy, it sounds like, and this went on for months and months in the system?
Yeah, it was not working, and I was it broke me in a way. I felt more and more hopeless and more separated from any possibility of things ever getting better and ever going. I had to drop out of university and of ever going back to university. I couldn't see any path out, and then it was suggested that I should have electroshock, and so that's what happened. There were a lot of moments that I realized that we weren't seen as humans, we weren't seen as people, we were seen as these awful threats. There were psych nurses who wouldn't walk in front of us, they always had to walk behind us because they were acting like we would attack them, and we were not even thinking about anything like that. I remember seeing people self-harming and then being treated like they were these awful nuisance. Attention seeking was a word that was used all the time, and didn't deserve to be sutured, didn't deserve to be cared for or comforted. And of course the other patients would end up being the ones who provided that care. I had meaningful relationships in hospital with some people who are still in my life and some people who are not alive. And I think a turning point for me was when I made a suicide attempt, and I ended up being treated in a way that was horrible. I always think that after you've been strapped down, something changes. The next time you walk into a store or you do something normal, you're not the same person. You're someone who's been strapped down, you've been treated like an animal. And I think that a lot of things that happen when people make suicide attempts are punishment. They have no healing effect. There's no understanding for someone in that situation, which is the most natural situation to be in so much distress that you want to get out. Like that's a human response to pain, is to try to stop the pain. And it's nothing from another planet. It's completely something that most caring friends understand and many people can relate to, even though it's not a conversation that's easy to have. But I think that treatment and the use of nasal tubes with charcoal and in a very, very, very nasty way were designed to teach you a lesson so you wouldn't do it again. And I think it is very hard to move on from that. And I don't think I ever really wanted to talk about it, or I did talk about it. I think I just wanted to get up the next day and walk down the street and pretend to be someone that had never happened to. And that was very much how I lived my life in relation to psychiatry, was just not to talk about these things and many things that were much worse that happened to people around me. I think that I was fairly lucky, maybe because I was socialized to be compliant. Like I was a very shy girl, and after I had electroshock, it changed my personality a little bit. I became very, very, very angry. Like some people who are older, who are losing their memories, become very, very frustrated and angry. And I can remember how terrifying it was not to be able to, know very basic words in the English language. Like potato, I think, was a word that I struggled with. And for me, that was terrifying because I never felt like I was anything more than my mind. And here was my mind just being dissembled, it seemed. And a very strange consciousness, because you are aware that this is happening to your mind. So it's you, but you're also losing yourself at that moment. And I think I was very lucky with electroshock in a way, because I think it's got much worse. I think now they apply it to both sides of people's head, and people have longer treatments, and it's the impact on memory is even worse. What I did go through traumatized me for sure. I just didn't talk about it.
You said that there were some things that you saw with other patients at the hospital. What were some of the things that you witnessed?
I think that there's kind of a technological approach to care in Australia. Like it's all about the new drugs and the new ECT, and everything is with euphemisms. People don't really talk about the reality of solitary confinement, what it means to not have a toilet and to be locked up. But they all have different euphemistic words, and everyone thinks in the public thinks it's about care and healing, and that people should be taken into these systems because it's natural. I think people think it's completely fine and natural, and it's only when you've been inside that you see that it's it feels like experimentation, and you see people whose lives are really cut short, people you care about, who are just suffering the results of something that was done to them in the system that's completely separate to whatever they came in, the reason they came in the first place, or the reason they were taken in the first place. I think that felt like I saw a lot of fraud, like basically that doctors would come up to people at times when they were not really able to speak, or at meals, older people who had just had electroshock, and try to get them to sign forms, and that it just seemed like a big money-making thing for psychiatrists is what I perceived. But it's been some years now as well, and I think things have got much worse. I think community treatment has increased exponentially in my state, Victoria. I think it is the highest in the world.
Community treatment meaning having court orders to force people to be on psychiatric medications in the community under threat of being taken back and locked up in the hospital. Yeah,
we say CTOs, but you need to turn up for appointments to be force drugged. Otherwise you have an injection, otherwise you will be taken back.
And what would you say to that person who's maybe thinking, well, look, these are psychotic people. These are people with extreme distress and emotional problems. Sure, there's some problems with the treatments, but this is really trying to help them and to keep them, safe and off the streets, because they can't actually be at home. They really need to be in hospitals. What might you say to somebody who's thinking that?
I think that the impulse to connect with people and to stop suffering, maybe this is understandable. It's a human impulse, but it's actually completely counterproductive to force anyone to do anything. A very, very powerful survivor figure in my life, the activist Claire Shaw, she talks about having a really crap day, just having the worst day you could possibly have, and coming home and feeling terrible and finding the cat's vomited on the rug and everything's gone wrong, and then just wanting to do the one thing that would calm you, which is very often like things that the outside world perceives as dangerous or psychotic, but maybe it's to hurt yourself, or maybe it's to reach out in a way that is frightening because you appear distressed and chaotic, or whatever it is. And then when people say to you the one thing that you want to do that would calm you, you have to be forcibly restrained from doing that. You have to. When people try to force you to suppress this instinct, which is a survival instinct, really, it's the worst possible thing that could happen. I think it completely crushes and traumatizes, and just leaves you feeling very, very alone and misunderstood, and then finding secret ways to do the thing that would help, whether it's planning your own death, or whether it's hurting yourself in a different way, or whatever it is. It's really about having a conversation with the person and honoring the thing that they're doing. They're trusting the community with, by when someone says, I want to die, in a way they are really showing an incredible amount of trust in the community to then come forward and say, I hear you, I can hear what's happening, tell me more, how can we find a way that would change things for you. That's a huge act of trust, especially knowing that that's not the culture we live in, that it's not a culture where you can have those conversations, and it's not a culture where there are many people who will say, what can we do, without saying, I'm going to force you to do this or do that.
How did you survive this? How did you make it out of that system to where you are today?
I was fortunate because I was able to stay at university. I had to drop out many times, but eventually I found a place for myself in the Russian department. It was like this very peripheral department in the university that no one really invested in because Russian wasn't seen as some economically useful subject. And so I was able to get some money to get away from Australia, which was what I felt I needed to do. I didn't remember a lot of what had happened around ECT. I also knew that I continued to be a very distressed person, and I couldn't see how someone like me, who was sometimes okay, sometimes not okay, would ever be able to be financially independent, would ever be able to have a life independent of psychiatry. And I wanted to start again. I think that's what I felt I needed to escape. It was like almost another kind of suicide attempt. I wanted to end my life in Australia and start again where no one knew me. And I had so much shame about what had happened to me.
So in a way, you became an exile like your family did.
Yeah, unconsciously, I would say. It wasn't totally planned. It was more, an escape. I guess is the meaning of asylum, really. Like, I was trying to find asylum in the world. And I know that one thing I noticed many things. I was very alone. I spent a lot of time on my own, and I noticed that when I was studying Russian, I was discovering a new language that was not only new linguistic structures, but a new way of thinking about the world. And it was actually a language where emotion had more place than in English. People could speak in a very dark, humid way about feeling awful, about wanting to die, and no one had different meaning. And so I felt actually like this language itself was finding a new way to be in the world.
And Deborah, let's talk about how you're living today, because some of the things, the traumas that you experience, I know that you're carrying with you, and also just the ways in which you're just different, the way that you learned as a child to just be different in the world. And I know that some of that was diagnosed, and they talk about thought disorder or personality disorder, or different psychiatric labels for that.
There was a break in my biography, I guess, where I was not thinking about myself in terms of psychiatry at all. I moved to the Czech Republic and I found a job, not a very good job, but I found a job, and I was able to do things I never had. Psychiatry had told me I wouldn't be able to do, like make enough money to buy stuff for myself and pay rent, but I was still struggling a lot, and I was trying to figure out what had happened in Australia and to find a way to not be so distressed as I was all the time. Every time things would get overwhelming for me with deadlines or social pressures or anything, I would really, really struggle. I would suffer a lot. And I was very conscious about never appearing suicidal to other people, because I'd grown up knowing how awful it is to carry around fear that someone might hurt themselves. Like I was so conscious of that, and I always spoke about my effect in the world. That was like something psychiatry taught me. And then this got very exacerbated, and it led to a crisis because I found out from a psychiatrist, a woman psychiatrist, who had seen me in Australia, that my diagnosis, which I hadn't ever known, was personality disorder, was borderline personality disorder. And I remember when I read this, it was in an email the first time, and she said this, and it was like something dropped through me. It was like myself shattered into 1,000 pieces. I couldn't move. I felt absolutely destroyed as a person. The words, just that there was something wrong with my personality, myself, and that you can't actually do a Google search. You can't go on the internet. The internet is not a safe place for you if you have had that diagnosis. It's like, being in a neighborhood full of people who are going to taunt you, for something that you don't even really understand, but something they perceive in you. And every website is about how awful people with this diagnosis are, how manipulative and attention-seeking and incurable, or only curable through careful, infantilizing thought modification programs. It's really, I can't really put into words how much this hurt me, and how alone and how ashamed I felt. I felt like I couldn't even, what is very difficult and people might not know is that anger that you feel at having had this happen to you is very much based on the fear it's true. As much as it's crap. And I was a pretty critical person. I mean, I was a very critical person. I didn't have any respect for psychiatry, and I didn't respect anything about the logic or the care or anything in psychiatry. There's something in psychiatry that represents a whole cultural way of looking at distress, and way of looking at people who don't appear to be productive and coping and self-sufficient, and people who appear to be needy, and in a way that, because they don't have enough support perhaps, or for whatever reason. And it was devastating. I wasn't able to function after that happened at all. My life stopped, and it was more than ECT, more than anything. That was the thing that made my life unlivable. And it was very hard to even explain to other survivors how much that destroyed me. But I went looking for answers. I connected with a UK activist called Claire Shaw, who's done a lot of critical work about the diagnosis and the use of the diagnosis, especially against women, and the impact of the diagnosis, and does a lot of work on alternatives to support people in crisis, and is just she's a poet as well, someone who was very important to me. It was important to find that my experience that I was so ashamed of wasn't unique. I'd never actually met psychiatric survivors, people who were politically organizing, and I suppose I didn't even know I was looking for them. And then Claire had received another letter and a few other letters from people in a similar situation to me, people who had been so injured by this insult that their lives had stopped. And she put me in touch with them, and then we started to be a very small collective of women activists who were campaigning for the abolition of all psychiatric diagnoses, but especially of the personality disorders, which are their death sentence. You feel subhuman. You don't feel like a person who warrants care. And I stopped being able to socialize. I felt like if I was distressed, I shouldn't call my friends because that would be attention seeking. I would still be able to comfort friends because I had such a big range of emotional experiences and known people who had complicated lives, and it wasn't only natural. It was what I wanted to do. It was completely comfortable for me. But I couldn't seek care. I couldn't seek support. It's very, very hard. I even did some activism with some UK activists. They had a conference about personality disorder, and standing up on the stage and saying I had this diagnosis, that was very difficult. Like you feel like no one in the room looks at you the same again. No one looks at you as though something happened to you. They look at you as though you've said that you were a child molester. That's what it feels like. your damaged goods.
If you're just tuning in, this is Madness Radio, and our guest today is Rita Marshall. Deborah is a psychiatric survivor and human rights activist who grew up in Australia and today works as an editor in Prague, Czech Republic. Judith Herman, who's the author of the book Trauma and Recovery, described the borderline personality disorder as essentially a sophisticated insult. It's the most dehumanizing of things you can say to someone. And I remember when I was part of my schooling, there was a class on psychopathology, and we were talking about borderline personality disorder. And so they decided they would show a horror film where the woman is a murderer and she's like killing men. And this was the example, the case example of what it is. And really when someone says that another person is borderline, it's really a code word for don't listen to this person, don't get close to this person, don't interact with this person. They need to be in a separate category. And so it's a very, very devastating diagnosis. It's actually really an update of the word hysteria, which is so clearly a misogynist term, and borderline is just a continuation of that sexism, because it really is directed primarily at women. And all the research connects trauma histories. So there's a very clear political aspect to this, where people who really should be encouraged and supported to look at their histories and the social context of their experience and the way in which trauma has played itself out in their lives, instead are pushed to seeing themselves as defective and seeing a problem inside of them, inside of their own selves, inside of their own personalities. And this question of personality disorder is very closely tied to the whole question of, well, how do you live differently in the world? Because you are somebody who has difficulty communicating. I'm someone who has difficulty communicating. And so it may be that there are times when I withdraw or I disengage and I'm not able to communicate or not able to speak. And in those moments, if my friends say, oh, Will, you're doing your schizoid thing, or Will, you're dissociating, or Will, you're having a trauma experience, this kind of language can often make me feel pathologized and put down and dehumanized. And it's not a symptom of my schizophrenia that I'm staying in my room and not talking to you about my feelings. That's a way of me going through my experience that's maybe different than other people, but it doesn't show that I'm defective or somehow genetically abnormal or there's somehow something wrong with me on my person level. It's just a way that I'm working through my experience that's different than other people.
Yeah, I do agree with what you've said about personality disorder. I've witnessed it having horrible legal effects on people's lives as well, where they can't get childcare, or where people who've been sexually harassed at work, what they say, their words are, completely undermined because, or sexual assault is completely undermined because they're attention seeking and manipulative and these things. And then the experience of distress is also culturally and psychiatrically put into other words. And I very much agree that when someone comes to you and tells you what is happening for you and even explains it in a way that they think is doing you a big favor, which I think a lot of people in the personality disorder industry, because it is an industry, there's huge amounts of money in it, there's a growing diagnosis, there are big centers and therapies that are huge money spinners for the people responsible, and that are easily to replicate, so they can get spread all over the world very fast, like McDonald's. Those people think they're doing people. Some of them, I think they're doing you this great favor to explain in what they don't even understand is a patronizing way how your little mind and consciousness and your trauma history work. But it leaves me feeling very, very alone and alienated. And I actually think that inviting someone, even someone who's struggling to communicate, which is often me, into a conversation and respecting their rhythm, respecting the speed and the time and whatever they need to feel safe, and letting it be in their own words. Like the theorist Arthur Frank, he talks about letting people's stories breathe. And I think there is something in this aspiration, literally being able to be safe, start to find words that make sense to you, that connect with you, that make you feel more part of the human language, and then whatever framework makes sense to you. I think sometimes we're like birds and we just sort of go around picking up bits and pieces of different frameworks and different schema that, connect, maybe not even permanently, but just for this moment in my life. Whether that's human rights discourse, whether that's in a particular alternative, whether that's, for me, it's often been in literature to see crazy characters, and that it's okay for Anna Karenina to not know how to cope without someone saying she has a personality disorder. It's okay for Medea to not cope with her kids without someone saying she's a bad mother. It's just, I think we find our own ways and systems, and no one else has the right to tell you who you are or to explain your story to you, even if they think that they're doing you this giant favor by giving you a label.
I think you point to something really important. It's really about the power relations. Is it an empowering experience? Does it make someone feel more themselves, or does it put them in a position of dependency and control and something from the outside defining you from words that aren't yours, that don't really reflect your experience, but that are really more the clinical gaze of the clinician or the DSM or the doctor that is deciding for you what your experience is?
I agree with that. And I think that what is difficult for some activists, for me it's been difficult, is that there are people in the psychiatric patients who do connect with the clinical framework. I've been at conferences where people have stood up and said, the borderline personality disorder saved my life. And the professionals seem very happy to hear that there's someone saying, that their product was so wonderful. But it's been very, very hard as someone who was destroyed by that diagnosis and had to rebuild my sense of self-worth and my right to be in the world after that diagnosis, to hear that it was beneficial to someone. And I think that respecting everyone's right to decide on how helpful psychiatry and its frameworks are is another part of it, which is some activism, I think, can err on the side of almost assuming that these people haven't reached consciousness yet. It's quite patronizing itself in the activist movement to sort of feel like, you're not as evolved as me because you believe in psychiatry.
Yeah, in a very strange way, I think that activists can become psychiatrists in reverse, just without the social power, because we start to diagnose the system and we say everything is in black and white terms, and therefore this diagnosis means this, but it's the opposite. It's always a bad thing. And that, I think, is in some ways plays out the shadow of psychiatry. And I think it comes from intense feelings of revenge and trauma and being hurt, but we have to be very careful about just not flipping the roles and doing the thing to the other side that we're so upset that they've been doing to us.
Yeah. I think the anger I had initially was life-saving, like it was possessed me. And I mean, shortly after I connected with Claire Shaw, I discovered your show, Madness Radio. And I was at a terrible point in my life. I was in so much pain thinking about this personality disorder and really not even able to I was barely able to go online because I would look it up and get lost in these awful, awful websites where people were comparing stories about the BPDs, the borderlines in their lives, as they would say. And I discovered your show, and I was in so much pain that I wasn't able to sit still and listen to it. I was so anxious. I started to go running, and running was like Russian for me. It was something completely new. I had two very flat feet. I walked like a duck, people would say, but I forced myself to go running in the snow in Prague while listening to your show. And when I heard that there were other people in the world who were angry, who had had similar experiences, who had begun to make poetry and who had begun to come up with alternative ways of working and being active, it was like little explosions in my head of a good kind. And that was really amazing. And that's actually how I connected with the European movement. I heard some activists from Europe on your show, and then I emailed the European network.
I'm so glad to hear that Madness Radio was helpful to you, Deborah. I'm really glad you're here with us today and doing the work that you're doing and speaking out about this. And And one of the things I'm really interested in is the idea of a social model of disability, the idea that it is possible for people to be different, to maybe come from an experience that isn't shared by most people, and it still doesn't have to be a problem inside of the person. It's about how we relate to those people, and do we make space for different styles of communication? Do we make space for people with different needs? Do we make space for all the people who are not only trauma survivors themselves, but come from generations of trauma? What do we do about all the people who have been so shaped by the Holocaust, so shaped by the widespread violence that has happened through history? Do we hold them up to a normal standard, or do we say, look, we're going to meet you with your experiences and we're going to work with you to really value and respect the ways that you've learned to protect yourself and to cope and to live with what you've been through? So this question of how do we embrace difference and diversity and really see things in terms of social responsibility rather than, okay, there's a defect in the individual, or you're not measuring up to our standard of normal or productive or functional in society.
I struggle with the social model of disability, and I can't pretend to give some kind of like helpful primer to what it is, because I struggle with it. But I think that there's traditionally an idea of disability as being something inside a person and being a flaw or an impairment. You are not able to walk, or you're not able to see. The social model of disability is far more focused. It's exclusively focused on how your environment, the attitudes of people around you, what is accessible, what is required, how these things are oppressive if you don't fit into a particular mold of what a person should be in the world. So the disability doesn't lie inside you at all. The disability is in the interaction with your way of being in the world and what the world allows you to do. So it's probably clearer. It is much clearer if you have a physical disability, because this model was devised by people who came out of the disability rights movement, who were many people with physical disabilities. But for instance, you know, your building might not be accessible, or a text might not be readable, and then you can see the disabilities existing outside of you. I struggle with it. It wasn't a natural language for me to relate to my experience, partly because it was something that I didn't see immediate connections with. It didn't feel emotionally right. It wasn't my language. And I think also because there's quite a big need to explain what happens to people who end up in psychiatry as being basic human experiences that are not from some other realm, they're so it's very contradictory, but it gives me hope in some ways, because I think starting a conversation about what would a world where someone like me, who's sometimes okay, sometimes able to write things, sometimes able to connect with people, and then other times really struggles. Like, what would a world where someone like me is comfortable and accepted and even valued, what would that feel like? And I think that when I was in psychiatry, it was completely evident that everyone around me was extraordinarily sensitive. I mean, I shouldn't say everyone, I don't want to valorize psychiatric patients, but many people had extraordinary knowledge and skills, and that if these skills were what were valued in society, if there was a forum where they could be comfortable and accepted, then the world itself would be a much better place. I think that looking at the outside environment is something that is liberating. It's something different to the focus of psychiatry, which is like on persons, on brains, on minds, on biology, and on your, what do you call it, maladaptive functioning or whatever. It's all like you're a machine that doesn't work the way you're meant to, but instead taking the focus outside, looking at what a space would be like where you're valued is something that could start some empowering conversations, perhaps. And that's where I find hope in the social model of disability. That's one place I find hope.
What are some of the things that you find that you do for yourself to live in the world as a person who communicates differently or has different struggles that they go through that doesn't embrace this framework of being borderline personality and the psychiatric labeling? How do you sort of manage to be in this world?
Sometimes not very well. I think that for a while, being part of an activist community was very important to me. It reminded me constantly of the correctness of my feelings and my positions, and that I wasn't the word that comes to mind is freak. I think that's probably what I think most of the self abuse is in psychiatric kind of language. I wasn't a borderline, and I think that was at the beginning. And now I actually think listening to myself is very important. Like if I'm in a social situation or some situation and I don't feel comfortable or something feels wrong, really being able to listen to that and take it seriously and not even have to explain it. Like I think that sometimes if you grow up with very, very distressed parents, you never actually have much space ever in your life or your history to think, what's going on for me? What do I need? You're just constantly trying to kind of mitigate the next disaster situation for them, or I'm super sensitive to what other people might need all the time. Not that I get it right, but I'm worrying about that. And so I think that knowing that I need time to myself, I need time with books, I need time to be physically active. That's very important, to be moving and running and to be changing my pace in the world. I think that's, I had a period where I spent a lot of time looking at art because it was just something completely different to me. It was like a different language and different way of expressing human emotion that I could connect with when I wasn't very verbal. So I don't know. I think these are things that people do. Some people have more kind of practice in doing them, and some of us are told from when we're very young, and then again in psychiatry, that, you know, these are not our rights in the world, to have our own space, to listen to how we feel, to just, you know, be okay with whatever it is. So you feel like you don't want to go on living. That's a feeling, you know, it's not something that you should have to suppress because it's so borderline or it's so, that's awful. I don't have the answers. In fact, I feel very humble in a way. I feel like I know less and less every day. Things I thought I knew, I don't know. I think that's part of it, though, that you're changing constantly. So you can't really come up with some little framework that is it. It's more like an ongoing human quest to find a way to survive. You know, as for psychiatric survivors, as an ongoing process, not as an accomplishment.
Deborah, you've done a lot of work with international activists, people from all over the world who are working to change psychiatry. You've met a lot of different people from different countries and done a lot of traveling. What are some things that you've learned from the international scene, different cultures and different nations, that is inspiring to you?
Recently, I've been more involved with the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, which has been a really, really wonderful experience, especially to connect with people who are doing advocacy in Africa, in India, in parts of the world where there may be less psychiatry. There often is less psychiatry, or there's psychiatry in different forms, but mad people and distressed people are oppressed in the community at the same time. Connecting with people in Eastern Europe where there's no social welfare and there's very, very few community services, and people have very, very distinct battles to even become economically separate from their family. So it could be a choice between a life in an institution or a life with a very, very oppressive family who's also violent towards you and controls everything you do. So I think that the loss of autonomy that we have as mad people and distressed people, that our right to decide on the really basic things in our lives and very crucial things like whether to be part of psychiatry or part of any treatment that someone else proposes, taken away from us, is something that connects. I think that's been very helpful to see connections, but also to see asymmetries. I think that advocacy from the global north has been very, very powerful and it's done some incredible things. It's achieved an enormous amount in international law in all sorts of ways. But I think it's important not to impose that language or that way of working, globally. I think and I think it's important not to cherry pick human rights abuses, not to say, oh, well, this thing in Africa is, it fits into our ideas about psychiatry. And certainly psychiatry is very, very frightening, the way psychiatry is spreading, the way it's being advocated by the World Health Organization and by many prominent academics and institutions in the West, in the global South, is terrifying. But I think it's all about dialogue. And that's what's inspiring, to listen to people's own take on what's happening and what would actually help, in locally, and then to ask what can we do together, what can we do to help each other.
Deborah, we are just about out of time. What have you heard activists from the global South asking for or recommending, or what kinds of changes are they looking for?
I think that what I have really taken in, what I've heard, is about the need to transform communities, to make communities into places that are more supportive, more welcoming, have opportunities for people to do meaningful work, to be economically empowered, to be socially supported, to have forms of support for distress that might be very old indigenous practices that people know are valuable and help, and are this magic word, phrase evidence-based. And these things, I suppose, if you are far more evidence-based than anything like locking people up or forcibly drugging them or forcibly electroshocking them, and to create spaces by working with other people in the community, people in positions of power, service providers, all kinds of people, to create non-institutional support. I guess there's a lot of work that's going on that is very, very, very encouraging. And I think there's in having this conversation, people can find ideas that make sense to them and apply them in their local community. Ask, what will we need to do that's different? A colleague of mine in Yolin Santigods is doing some incredible work on a model of family conferencing, which comes from practices that Maori elders in New Zealand have had, where if there's a problem in the community, one way of approaching the problem is to ask the person who is experiencing it, who are some people you value, whose opinions you trust, who you feel you could share this with, whose perspective would you like to hear? And then getting a group of people together, they call a family, in a sort of extended idea of family, together to describe in words that are non-pathological. I mean, of course, they're non-pathological, but they're the person's own words and their friends' own words for what's going on, and to come to some solutions that would actually be close to the person, and that the person might help the person to feel more connected with their community. So it's not only a problem of an individual, but it's a problem, not even a problem, it's just something happening in the community, that this person is distressed, and when they're distressed, it would be helpful to have one person that they could just call and say 2 words to, and those words would mean, hold my hand. Not even literally, but just hear me, be there. I need you. I think that it's very, very unique, and I can't say that I fully understand this model, or I think Yolina's doing some very, very exciting work by bringing different practices together, but I I don't know how it would work in all situations with people like me who are a little bit cut off from their families. But I think the main thing is that the conversation itself is happening, and I think that's enabled through the survivor movement, or the movement of people with psychosocial disabilities, as some people in the community identify.
Deborah Marshall, thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Thank you, Will.
You've been listening to an interview with Deborah Marshall. Deborah is a psychiatric survivor and human rights activist who grew up in Australia and today works as an editor in Prague, Czech Republic. And if you'd like to contact Deborah, you can send an email to the Madness Radio email address, which is info@madnessradio.net. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, co-sponsored by the Icarus Project, Portland Hearing Voices, and Freedom Center. Madness Radio is hosted by Will Hall, and producer is Leah Harris. Madness Radio is based at KBOO in Oregon and can be heard on FM stations on the Pacifica Radio Network. Listen on the internet at madnessradio.net and on iTunes. Contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.